The town of Havenwood was nestled in a valley, cradled by rolling hills that turned 100 shades of green in the spring and a fiery tapestry of orange and gold in the autumn. It was a place of picket fences, Sunday potlucks, and a comfortable, almost deliberate sense of timelessness. Crime in Havenwood was usually limited to teenagers tipping over mailboxes or the occasional dispute over property lines. It was a town that believed in the fundamental goodness of people because it had rarely been shown evidence to the contrary. That belief, as solid and ancient as the oak trees in the town square, was about to be shattered. At the edge of town, where the manicured lawns gave way to the wilder, untamed woods, stood Blackwood Manor. It wasn't a manor in the grand, aristocratic sense, but rather a sprawling Victorian house, once proud and elegant, now beautifully melancholic. Its paint was peeling in places, and ivy crept up its stone foundations like green veins, but it held a certain dilapidated grace. This was the ancestral home of the Blackwood sisters, Alara, Seraphina, and Lyra. They were Havenwood's enigmatic jewels. Alara, at 28, was the eldest, a painter whose canvases captured the haunting beauty of the surrounding woods with an almost supernatural intensity. Her dark hair was often streaked with paint, and her eyes held a quiet, observant depth. Seraphina, 25, was the musician. The melancholic notes of her cello would often drift from the manor's open windows, a beautiful, sad sound that seemed to become part of the town's atmosphere. She had a dreamer's face and a gentle disposition. Lyra, the youngest at 21, was the writer. She filled countless journals with poetry and short stories, her words weaving intricate tapestries of fantasy and folklore. She was the firecracker of the three, with a quick laugh and a restless energy that contrasted with her sister's more serene natures. Together, they were a self-contained universe of art and sisterhood. They had lost their parents years ago in a car accident and had clung to each other and their ancestral home with fierce devotion. The townspeople saw them as ethereal and slightly strange, the Blackwood girls, creatures of art and history who didn't quite belong in the modern world. They were admired from a distance, their privacy respected, their creative solitude an accepted part of their identity. That solitude was what made the initial silence so unnoticeable. It started on a Tuesday. No cello music drifted through the air. On Wednesday, the mail carrier, a portly man named George, noticed the previous day's mail was still in the box, but simply assumed the sisters were engrossed in their work. By Thursday, a sense of quiet unease began to settle over the neighbors closest to the manor. The house was dark. The curtains were drawn. It was a stillness that felt different from their usual reclusive peace. Felt final. It was Martha, their elderly neighbor from across the road, who finally made the call. She hadn't seen any lights, hadn't heard a single note from Seraphina's cello in 3 days. "It's just not right," she told the dispatcher, her voice trembling slightly. "That house is never completely silent." Detective Miles Corbin's car crunched up the gravel driveway of Blackwood Manor just as the late afternoon sun began to bleed across the sky, casting long, ominous shadows. Corbin was a man worn down by the ugliness he'd seen in his 20 years on the force in a larger city before transferring to Havenwood for a quieter life. He had a tired face, etched with the ghosts of past cases, and a cynicism that he wore like a well-worn coat. He had hoped Havenwood would be a place where the worst he'd have to deal with was a domestic dispute or a drunk driver. He could feel a cold dread coiling in his gut that told him his hope had been misplaced. His partner, Detective Ben Harding, was already there, standing by the patrol car that had responded to the wellness check. Harding was young, eager, and still believed that justice was a clean, straightforward equation. He looked pale. "Front door was unlocked," Harding said, his voice tight. The patrol officer went in, took one look, and came right back out. He called us immediately, said we needed to see it for ourselves. "Miles, it's bad." Corbin didn't reply. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the imposing silhouette of the house. It looked like something out of one of Lyra Blackwood's Gothic stories. He pulled on a pair of latex gloves and walked towards the porch. The unlocked door swung open with a low groan, as if the house itself was sighing in relief or despair. The air that hit them was the first sign of wrongness. It was cold, unnaturally so for a house that should have been sealed, and it carried a cloying, metallic scent mixed with something sickly sweet, like withered flowers. The entryway was immaculate, a grand foyer with a sweeping staircase. But there was a profound silence, a heavy, listening stillness that felt like a physical presence. "There in the parlor," Harding whispered, as if afraid to break the spell. Corbin followed him, his footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors. The parlor was a large room, filled with antique furniture, bookshelves crammed with old volumes, and a grand piano in the corner. Canvases painted by Alara leaned against the walls, vibrant and full of life. They were a stark, brutal contrast to the scene in the center of the room. The three sisters were there, but they were not as they should be. It wasn't a scene of chaotic violence. It was a tableau, a grotesque and meticulously arranged display. They were positioned like dolls, posed in a macabre parody of life. Alara was seated in a high-backed armchair, her hands folded in her lap, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Serafina lay on the chaise lounge, her beloved cello resting beside her, its strings cut. Lyra was on the floor, kneeling, with one of her journals open in front of her. They were all dressed in pristine, white, old-fashioned nightgowns that Corbin vaguely recognized as something from a bygone era. Their hair had been brushed, their faces cleaned. But the horror, the true, unspeakable violation, was in the mutilation. It was precise, deliberate, and symbolic. Each sister had been disfigured in a way that seemed to target the very essence of their being. Alara's hands, the hands that had created such beauty on canvas, were savaged. Serafina's throat, from which she would hum the melodies she played, bore a cruel, deep gash. And Lyra's eyes, the eyes that had consumed countless words and imagined endless stories, had been subjected to an unimaginable violation. Corbin felt a surge of acid rise in his throat. He had seen death in all its forms, brutal, senseless, tragic. But this was different. This wasn't the result of a heated argument or a robbery gone wrong. This was a performance. It was a declaration of power, a work of art crafted by a deeply disturbed and sadistic mind. "My God!" Harding breathed, his face ashen. He took a step back, bumping into a small table and rattling a porcelain music box that sat upon it. "Don't touch anything," Corbin snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. His mind was already racing, cataloging the details, pushing past the initial wave of horror to the cold, hard mechanics of the investigation. The room was a paradox. It was a scene of utter depravity, yet it was almost clinically clean. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken objects, save for the cello strings. It suggested the sisters were either incapacitated quickly or had been killed elsewhere and brought here to be arranged. The medical examiner would determine that later. Corbin's eyes scanned the room, looking for the small, insignificant detail that didn't fit. He saw it on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. Amongst the framed family photos and antique clocks, there were 3 small porcelain dolls. They were new, their painted faces shiny and unblemished. Each doll was dressed in an outfit that mirrored the sisters' own passions. One held a tiny paintbrush, another a miniature cello, and the third a small book. They were replicas, effigies. It was a signature. "He left them a gift," Corbin murmured to himself. The forensics team arrived, and the house, once a sanctuary of quiet creativity, was transformed into a sterile grid of scientific inquiry. The silence was replaced by the low hum of equipment, the click of cameras, and the hushed, professional voices of people trained to dissect tragedy. Corbin watched them work, feeling like an intruder in the sisters' violated world. He walked through the house, each room a testament to the lives that had been extinguished. Alara's studio was a beautiful mess of color and light. A half-finished painting sat on her easel, a landscape of the woods behind the house, so vibrant it seemed to breathe. Corbin wondered what she would have added, what final brushstroke would have completed her vision. In Serafina's room, sheet music was spread across her bed, notes waiting to be given voice. In Lyra's study, a stack of journals sat on her desk, their pages filled with her elegant script. He resisted the urge to open one, feeling it would be a profanity to read her private thoughts now. The killer had touched nothing else. He hadn't stolen their jewelry, which lay glinting on their dressers. He hadn't taken the antique silverware in the dining room. His only purpose had been the sisters themselves. He hadn't just killed them, he had curated their deaths. He had taken these vibrant, talented women and turned them into objects, porcelain dolls for his own twisted collection. As the bodies were carefully zipped into bags and carried out into the now dark night, a profound sadness settled over Corbin. This wasn't just a triple homicide. It was the obliteration of a small, beautiful world. The music, the art, the wordsit had all been silenced. Later that night, back at the station, the initial reports started to trickle in. The medical examiner's preliminary findings confirmed what Corbin had suspected. There were no signs of a struggle. The sisters had been drugged, likely with a powerful sedative. They had been helpless, unconscious, as the killer enacted his horrific ritual. The time of death was estimated to be sometime late Monday night or early Tuesday morning. They had been lying in that silent house for nearly 3 days. The mutilation, as the Me clinically termed it, was performed post-mortem. The killer hadn't tortured them in their final moments. He had killed them peacefully, if such a word could ever be used in this context, and then had taken his time, desecrating their bodies, transforming them into his art. This information did little to quell the horror. In fact, it amplified it. It spoke of a cold, methodical patience that was somehow more terrifying than a crime of passion. The town of Havenwood went into shock. Fear, a feeling they were entirely unaccustomed to, spread like a virus. Doors were locked, neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, and the story of the porcelain doll murders, as the media quickly dubbed it, became a national headline. The ethereal Blackwood girls had become famous, but for the one thing they would never have wanted: the grotesque artistry of their own deaths. Corbin sat in his office, the case file open on his desk. Photos of the crime scene were spread out before him. He stared at the picture of the 3 porcelain dolls on the mantelpiece. They were the key. They were the killer's message, his signature. This was a man who saw people not as human beings, but as objects to be collected, possessed, and perfected according to his own deranged vision. He thought about the kind of man who would do this. He was organized, patient, and meticulous. He likely watched the sisters for a long time, learning their routines, their passions, their vulnerabilities. He was arrogant, leaving his signature behind, confident he wouldn't be caught. And he was deeply, profoundly sick. Corbin felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders. This case reminded him of another one years ago, the one that had driven him from the city. The Sparrow case, a serial killer who had preyed on young women, leaving a single dead bird at each scene. He had never caught him. The case went cold, and the guilt had eaten away at him ever since. He wouldn't let that happen again. Not in his town. Not to these girls. He picked up the photo of Lyra, the young writer. Her open journal lay on the floor beside her posed body. Forensics had carefully bagged it as evidence. The killer had chosen a specific page to leave it open on. It was a poem. Corbin had read the transcript. It was a haunting piece about a man made of shadows who collected echoes and kept them in glass jars. It was a chilling piece of irony. Lyra Blackwood, in her final, unknowingly prophetic words, had written the story of her own killer. The man of shadows had come for them. And Corbin knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the man was addicted to his collection. He would not stop at 3 dolls. This was only the beginning. The silence of Blackwood Manor was not an ending. It was an overture. The week following the discovery at Blackwood Manor felt like a month. A suffocating blanket of fear and suspicion descended upon Havenwood, smothering its idyllic charm. The media circus had arrived in full force, their satellite trucks lining the streets like vultures, their reporters accosting grieving townspeople for sound bites. The case was no longer a local tragedy. It was a national obsession, a gothic horror story playing out in real time. For Detective Miles Corbin, it was a waking nightmare of paperwork, pressure, and the haunting images from the parlor that were now permanently seared into his memory. The initial investigation was a frustrating exercise in futility. The Blackwood sisters were reclusive, their circle of contact infinitesimally small. They had no known enemies, no jilted lovers, no shady business dealings. They ordered their groceries online, sold their art through a website, and rarely ventured into town for anything other than supplies. They were, by all accounts, as innocent and isolated as the townsfolk had always perceived them to be. Their killer had exploited that very isolation. "The forensics report is a dead end," Harding said, dropping a thick file on Corbin's desk. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days. No foreign DNA, no fingerprints other than the sisters. The place was wiped clean, meticulously. Our guy wore gloves, a full bodysuit, the works. He was a ghost. A ghost with a very specific, very loud signature, Corbin countered, tapping a photo of the porcelain dolls. These weren't bought at a local toy store. Forensics traced the materials. It's high-grade ceramic clay, custom-blended paints. These were handmade. Our killer is an artisan of some kind. This lead, while promising, opened up a dizzying number of possibilities. Could be a professional doll maker, a ceramicist, a sculptor, or just a hobbyist with a disturbing talent. They began the painstaking process of cross-referencing anyone in the state with a registered business or known history in such crafts. The list was long. Interviews with the few people who had regular contact with the sisters yielded little. George, the mail carrier, could only confirm their routine. The delivery drivers who dropped off their groceries and art supplies barely saw them, usually just leaving packages on the porch. Martha, the elderly neighbor, provided a timeline for the silence but had seen nothing unusual. They were such lovely, quiet girls, she'd wept, kept to themselves. Who could do such a thing? That was the question plaguing Corbin's every waking moment. The psychological profile from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit confirmed his own grim assessment. The killer was likely a white male, aged 30 to 50, highly intelligent, and organized. He was a classic psychopathic personality, devoid of empathy, but skilled at mimicking normal human emotions to blend in. He was a predator who engaged in extensive surveillance of his victims, fantasizing about his crime long before committing it. The report used phrases like sexual sadism, paraphilic obsession, and narcissistic rage. But the key takeaway for Corbin was the motive. The profiler believed the killer wasn't driven by a simple lust for violence. He was driven by a desire for possession and perfection. He saw the sisters as beautiful but flawed objects. Life, with its messiness and unpredictability, was the flaw. By killing them and posing them, he was perfecting them, turning them into eternal, static works of art that belonged only to him. The mutilations were symbolic acts of ownership, a way to destroy the parts of them that made them independent beings, the hands that painted, the voice that sang, the eyes that read. The phrase, "addicted to adult films," from the initial sensationalized headlines was both true and misleading. This wasn't a man trying to crudely replicate scenes from mainstream pornography. His addiction was to a much darker, more niche corner of the internet, a world of violent, degrading, and often simulated capture and torture scenarios. He wasn't just a consumer of this filth, he was a student. He was learning, refining his methodology, and escalating from fantasy to reality. The staging of the sisters was his first masterpiece, the culmination of years of obsessive consumption. Days turned into a week, then two. The pressure from the mayor, from the state police, from the national news was immense. But there were no new leads. The ghost had vanished back into the ether. Havenwood began to breathe a tentative sigh of relief. The consensus was that this was the work of a transient, a monster who had passed through and was now long gone. Corbin didn't buy it for a second. This killer was too comfortable, too knowledgeable about the sisters' routine. He knew the layout of the house. He knew their passions. This was his hunting ground. He wasn't a transient. He was hiding in plain sight. Corbin found himself repeatedly drawn back to the manor. The crime scene tape was still up, and the house stood as a silent, sealed monument to the tragedy. He would walk the perimeter trying to see what the killer saw, to find the vantage point from which he must have watched them. There was a thicket of trees on a small rise about 200 yards from the back of the house. It offered a clear, unobstructed view into the parlor and the studio. He and Harding combed the area. It took hours, but they finally found it. A small, trampled-down patch of earth, hidden from the main path. On the ground were several cigarette butts, all the same brand, and a single, small, almost missed object half buried in the dirt. It was a lens cap from a high-end telephoto lens. "He's a photographer," Corbin said, the pieces clicking into place. "Or at least a serious amateur. That's how he learned everything. He didn't just watch them. He documented them. He studied them like a biologist studying a specimen." The discovery re-energized the investigation. They now had a new profile to work with, an artisan, possibly a ceramicist or sculptor, who was also a skilled photographer. The list of potential suspects narrowed, but only slightly. They began investigating every professional photographer, camera shop owner, and known photography enthusiast in Havenwood and the surrounding counties. One name that came up was Arthur Finch. Finch owned a small, unassuming shop on Havenwood's main street called Finch's Fine Portraits. He was the town's go-to photographer for weddings, high school yearbooks, and family portraits. He was a quiet, meticulous man in his late 40s, unmarried, who lived alone in a small apartment above his shop. He was socially awkward but polite, a man who faded into the background. He was, by all accounts, completely harmless. Corbin and Harding paid him a visit. The shop was neat and orderly, the walls lined with smiling, happy families frozen in time. Finch himself was nervous, constantly cleaning his glasses and avoiding eye contact. "The Blackwood sisters?" he said, his voice soft. "A terrible, terrible tragedy. I can't imagine. No, I didn't know them personally. I'd see them in town once in a blue moon, but they were very private." "You're a photographer, Mr. Finch?" Corbin stated, his eyes scanning the studio. "Ever take walks in the woods near their property? For nature shots, perhaps?" Finch's Adam's apple bobbed. "Sometimes. The woods are beautiful, but I never went near their home. I respect people's privacy." He had an alibi for the time of the murders. He claimed he was at home developing film. There was no one to verify it. He smoked the same brand of cigarettes they found in the woods, but so did 100 other people in town. His camera equipment used a different brand of lens cap. He was a dead end, but Corbin couldn't shake a feeling of unease about the man. There was a watchfulness in his eyes, a stillness that felt predatory. But a feeling wasn't evidence. The investigation stalled again. The national media began to pack up, moving on to the next sensational story. Havenwood was left with its fear and its ghosts. The Blackwood Manor was boarded up, a dark stain on the edge of town. The case was turning cold. It was Lyra's journal that brought the first real break. Corbin had been granted permission to read through all her writings, hoping to find a clue, a mention of a stalker, a strange encounter, anything. For weeks, he read through her elegant prose, her fantastical stories, and her deeply personal poetry. He felt like a voyeur, but he pushed on. Deep in her most recent journal, he found a series of entries that made the hair on his arms stand up. They were from the month leading up to the murders. October 12th. "There's a feeling I can't shake, a sense of being watched. When I'm in the garden, I sometimes feel a prickle on my neck, as if eyes are on me from the woods. Alara says I'm being dramatic, that it's the poet in me seeing phantoms. But the feeling is so real." October 19th. "I saw him today. Not his face, just a shape. A man in the trees at the edge of our property. He had a camera with a long lens. When he saw me looking, he melted back into the shadows. It wasn't a bird watcher. He was watching us. I told Serafina, and now she's spooked too. We've been keeping the curtains drawn." October 26th. "He leaves us things. Small, strange gifts on the porch. A perfectly preserved butterfly under a glass dome. A single, flawless white rose. Last night, it was a small clay bird, beautifully sculpted, but with its neck broken. Alara threw it into the woods, furious. She said we should call the police. I don't know why, but I feel a strange sense of dread. A feeling that involving others would only make it worse. Feels like he's playing a game with us. Corbin's blood ran cold. The clay bird. Beautifully sculpted, but broken. It was the same MO. The killer wasn't a stranger who struck from nowhere. He had been courting them, terrorizing them in a slow, methodical game of cat and mouse. And they hadn't told anyone, out of fear or pride, or a naive belief that if they ignored him, he would go away. The mention of the sculpted clay bird sent Corbin straight back to the list of local artisans. There was one name he had glossed over before, Franklin Thorne. Thorne was a reclusive sculptor who lived about 10 miles out of town. He was known for his incredibly lifelike sculptures of animals and people. He was also a convicted felon, having served time a decade ago for assault and unlawful surveillance. He had been caught stalking and secretly filming a college student. Corbin and Harding drove out to Thorne's property immediately. It was an isolated compound, surrounded by a high fence. The yard was littered with his creations. Stone gargoyles, bronze animals, and eerily lifelike statues of women. They looked like a silent, captive audience. Thorne was a big man, with powerful hands and cold, empty eyes. He was evasive and hostile. When they asked to see his workshop, he refused, demanding a warrant. While Harding kept Thorne occupied, Corbin took a quick, surreptitious look around the property. In a trash can near the back of the workshop, underneath some discarded clay and rags, he saw it. A small, flawed porcelain hand, identical in style and material to the dolls left at the crime scene. It was a mistake, a piece the killer had discarded. It was all the probable cause he needed. They got the warrant. The search of Franklin Thorne's workshop was a journey into a serial killer's sanctuary. In a hidden, soundproofed basement, they found his obsession laid bare. The walls were covered with hundreds of photographs of the Blackwood sisters. Long-lens shots of them gardening, reading, painting, living their lives, completely unaware of the predatory eyes that were capturing their every move. There were shelves filled with sculpted clay birds, some perfect, some with their necks broken. And then they found the studio. In the center of the room was a potter's wheel and a kiln. On shelves lining the walls were dozens of porcelain dolls in various stages of completion. But this wasn't the most horrifying discovery. In a locked, refrigerated cabinet, they found his trophies. Trophies taken from previous victims, women who had been reported as missing persons from neighboring states over the past 5 years. He had been honing his craft, practicing, evolving. The Blackwood sisters weren't his first victims. They were just his first masterpiece, the first time he had left his signature for the world to see. He had a dedicated computer setup. The search history was a cesspool of the most depraved and violent pornography imaginable. It was a library of cruelty, a blueprint for his actions. He didn't just watch it. He studied it, took notes, and downloaded terabytes of the material. He was a scholar of sadism. Franklin Thorne was their man. The evidence was overwhelming. The lens cap brand matched one found in his camera bag. The clay from the discarded hand was a perfect match to the dolls. His DNA was on the cigarette butts. The ghost had a face. The arrest of Franklin Thorne sent a wave of relief, followed by a shudder of revulsion, through Havenwood. The monster had been living among them, a reclusive artist whose dark obsession went unnoticed until it was too late. The news crews returned, and Havenwood was once again at the center of a storm. But for Corbin, something was wrong. It was too easy. The discarded hand in the trash, Thorne's almost theatrical hostility, it felt like a performance. Psychopaths like Thorne were meticulous. They didn't make clumsy mistakes like that. And during his interrogation, Thorne was defiant, arrogant, but he never confessed. He just smiled a cold, knowing smile, as if he were enjoying a private joke. The night after the arrest, Corbin couldn't sleep. He sat in his office, looking at the evidence board. Thorne's face stared back at him, next to the smiling photos of the sisters. The fit, the profile, the evidence, the history, it all fit perfectly. So why did he have this gnawing feeling in his gut that they had the right church, but the wrong pew? He thought back to his interview with Arthur Finch, the Quiet Town photographer. He remembered the man's nervous energy, but also the intense, watchful quality in his eyes. He pulled up Finch's file again. No criminal record. A model citizen. But he had lied about one thing. He said he didn't know the sisters. Corbin had found a receipt in the Blackwoods' financial records. A month before the murders, Alara Blackwood had purchased several $1,000s worth of professional photography equipment from Finch's Fine Portraits. It was a small lie, a meaningless omission, perhaps. Finch probably just didn't want to be connected, however tangentially, to a horrific murder investigation. But why lie at all? Corbin's phone rang. It was Harding, his voice frantic. "Miles, you need to get down here. We just got the lab results back from Thorne's computer. There's a hidden, encrypted partition. We finally cracked it." "What's on it?" Corbin asked, already standing up. "It's a correspondence. Emails. Going back years." He wasn't working alone, Miles. He was mentoring someone, teaching them, guiding them. A cold dread washed over Corbin. Who? The emails are from an anonymous, encrypted address, but the person he's talking to, he calls him his protégé, his true artist. They planned the Blackwood murders together. Thorne was the muscle, the one who did the abductions and the wet work. But the staging, the posing, the mutilations, the porcelain dolls, that was all the protégé's idea. Thorne writes that he's a mere craftsman, but his partner is the visionary. Corbin was already out the door, his keys in his hand. He knew. He didn't know how he knew, but the certainty was absolute. "They found something else, Miles," Harding said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "In the last email Thorne received, just a day before we arrested him, the protégé sent him a picture. It's a new work in progress. A new set of dolls he's making." "A new set for who?" Corbin asked, his heart pounding. "For his next project," Harding said grimly. "There are 4 dolls this time. A mother, a father, and their 2 young daughters. Miles, the dolls are modeled after Ben Harding's family." Corbin slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a halt in the middle of the empty street. Thorne wasn't the artist. He was the apprentice. He was the blunt instrument. And by arresting him, they had done exactly what the true killer wanted. They had taken the brute off the board, leaving the meticulous, invisible artist free to continue his work. And he had just made it personal. The echo of broken things was about to get much, much louder. The revelation from the encrypted emails shattered the precinct's brief sense of victory. The monster they had caged, Franklin Thorne, was merely the opening act. The true artist, the visionary behind the grotesque tableau in the Blackwood parlor, was still out there. And now, he had made Detective Ben Harding his next subject. The case had transformed from a professional hunt into a desperate, personal race against time. Harding was immediately placed on leave and his family moved to a secure, undisclosed location under police protection. The man was a wreck, torn between the instinct to protect his family and the furious desire to hunt the man who was tormenting them. Corbin watched his young partner, seeing the raw fear behind the anger, and felt the familiar, cold weight of responsibility settle upon him. This was his case, his town, his partner. The failure would be his alone. The encrypted emails were their only window into the killer's mind. They were a chilling dialogue between master and apprentice, though it quickly became clear who held the real power. Thorne was the student, full of brutal rage and a need for violence. The anonymous protégé, whom Thorne referred to only as Maestro, was the teacher, the philosopher of their shared psychosis. Maestro wrote in detached, academic prose about the aesthetics of permanence and the flaw of the living canvas. He guided Thorne, reining in his cruder impulses and shaping them into the ritualistic murders. It was Maestro who had chosen the Blackwood sisters, calling them the perfect triptych. It was Maestro who designed the dolls, specifying every detail. And it was Maestro who had orchestrated the evidence trail that led directly to Thorne. "The craftsman must be sacrificed for the art to be appreciated," one email read. "They will catch you, Franklin. That is part of the design. Your capture will be the final brushstroke on the Blackwood canvas. It will create a beautiful, tragic silence, a void in which my next work can be born. Thorne was a willing pawn. The plan was for him to be caught, to take the fall, leaving the maestro free, a ghost in the machine. And the target was Harding's family. Why? The emails provided the sickening answer. It was a critique. Maestro saw the police investigation as a clumsy, brutish intrusion into his art. He wanted to demonstrate his superiority, to prove that he could touch anyone, even one of their own. Taking Harding's family would be his magnum opus, a masterpiece of terror and control. Every resource was now focused on one goal: identifying Maestro. They had his words, his twisted ideology, but not his name. Corbin was convinced he knew who it was. The quiet, unassuming photographer Arthur Finch. All the pieces fit. The lie about knowing the sisters. The watchfulness in his eyes. The professional understanding of cameras and lenses. A photographer was an artist of light and shadow, someone who captured and froze moments in time. It was a chillingly appropriate profession for a man obsessed with turning living people into static objects. But intuition wasn't enough. He needed proof. Corbin put Finch under 24/7 surveillance. 2 unmarked cars were parked on his street, and plainclothes officers tailed him on his rare excursions. But Finch's routine was maddeningly mundane. He opened his shop at 9, closed it at 5, went to the grocery store on Tuesdays, and got takeout from the same Chinese restaurant on Fridays. He was a creature of perfect, boring habit. He never went near Harding's house. He never did anything suspicious. He was either innocent, or he was the most disciplined monster Corbin had ever encountered. Corbin decided to push him. He went back to Finch's fine portraits, this time alone. The bell above the door chimed, and Finch emerged from his back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. He seemed surprised, and a flicker of something fear, annoyance, crossed his face before being replaced by a mask of mild curiosity. "Detective Corbin," he said softly. "How can I help you?" "I have a few follow-up questions about the Blackwood case, Mr. Finch," Corbin began, his tone casual. He walked around the studio, feigning interest in the portraits on the wall. "It's a funny thing about memory. Sometimes a small detail can shake something loose. You said you didn't know the sisters, but we have a record that Alara Blackwood bought some fairly expensive camera equipment from you about a month before she died." Finch's hands tightened on the cloth. "Oh, that. Yes, I suppose she did. It was a brief transaction. She knew what she wanted. I didn't make the connection at first. So many customers, you see." "Of course," Corbin said, stopping in front of a portrait of a young girl holding a single white rose. "We also know they were being stalked. Someone was leaving them gifts. Strange little things. One of them was a single, flawless white rose." He turned to face Finch. The man's face was pale, his breathing shallow. "That's a common prop for portraits, detective. A symbol of innocence." "Is it?" Corbin pressed, taking a step closer. "The man who helped Franklin Thorne, his partner, the real brains of the operation, sees himself as an artist. Someone who perfects his subjects. Someone who turns them into, well, portraits." For the first time, Finch's composure cracked. A flash of pure, unadulterated hatred contorted his features. "You have no idea what art is," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are a clumsy child with muddy boots, stomping through a gallery." The mask was off. Corbin knew he had him. But in that moment, Finch's eyes darted towards the clock on the wall. A sudden, horrifying realization dawned on Corbin. This whole time they had been played. The surveillance, the pressure, the interview sit was all a diversion. Finch wanted them watching him. "Where are they?" Corbin demanded, his hand moving to his sidearm. Finch smiled, a chilling, triumphant expression. "Art is not about where, detective. It is about when. And the exhibition is about to begin." Corbin shoved Finch against the wall, but the photographer just laughed, a high, thin sound. His phone rang. It was one of the officers on the surveillance team outside. "Sir, we have a problem." A delivery van just pulled up to the back of the shop. The driver went inside. "We're moving in. Don't let him out of your sight," Corbin yelled into the phone, turning back to Finch. But Finch was no longer smiling. His eyes were wide with genuine confusion. "Delivery van? I wasn't expecting a delivery." Corbin's mind raced. The emails, the meticulous planning, the sacrifice of the pawn. He had been so focused on Finch as the artist that he had missed the most obvious clue. Maestro called Thorne his craftsman, but he also called him his protégé. There was someone else, someone above them both. He ran out the back door of the shop, his gun drawn. The alley was empty except for a white, windowless van parked by the loading dock. The back doors were slightly ajar. The two officers who had been watching the back were on the ground, unconscious, felled by a taser. Corbin approached the van, his heart hammering against his ribs. He kicked the door open. It was empty, almost. In the center of the cargo space was a laptop, open and glowing. On the screen was a live video feed. It showed Harding's wife and two daughters. They were in a white, sterile room, tied to chairs. They were terrified, but unharmed. Standing behind them was a man in surgical scrubs and a mask. The man waved slowly at the camera. A text box appeared on the screen. "You were so close, detective. You found the apprentice and the craftsman. But you never looked for the patron. The patron. The money. The one who funded Thorne's workshop and Finch's dark hobby. The one who pulled the strings." Corbin's mind spun, trying to make a connection. Who had the money, the intelligence, and the twisted desire to orchestrate this entire nightmare? He looked back at the video feed. The masked man was holding up a porcelain doll, one modeled after Harding's youngest daughter. He then slowly, deliberately, snapped its arm off. In the sterile room, one of the real little girls screamed. Another message appeared. "You have 60 minutes to find them. The location is hidden in the one place you never bothered to look. Fail, and the performance will reach its tragic, inevitable conclusion. The one place he never bothered to look." Corbin ran back into the portrait studio. Finch was on the floor, handcuffed, a look of utter betrayal on his face. "Who is he?" Corbin roared, hauling him to his feet. "Who is the patron?" "I don't know," Finch whimpered. "He only ever contacted us online. He paid us in untraceable cryptocurrency. He gave the orders. We were just his tools." 60 minutes. Corbin's mind was a whirlwind. Where hadn't he looked? He had been through the sister's house, the evidence, the files 100 times. He stormed through Finch's studio, tearing pictures off the walls, knocking over equipment, searching for anything. He found Finch's darkroom. It was filled with surveillance photos of the Blackwoods, but also of dozens of other women in town. Finch had been scouting for Maestro for years. Then he saw it. Tucked away on a shelf was a set of old, leather-bound photography albums. They weren't Finch's work. The style was different, older. They were Havenwood Town archives. Group photos from decades past. The Founders' Day picnic of 1985. The high school graduating class of 1992. The dedication of the new library in 2001. Corbin flipped through the pages, not knowing what he was looking for. His eyes scanned the smiling faces, the pillars of the Havenwood community. Doctors, lawyers, the mayor. And then he saw him. In a photo from the library dedication, standing in the back, almost hidden in shadow, was a man he recognized. A man who had been on the periphery of the case from the very beginning. A man so respected, so above suspicion, that no one had ever thought to look at him twice. Dr. Alistair Croft, the county medical examiner. The man who had performed the autopsies on the Blackwood sisters. The man who had clinically described their mutilations without a hint of emotion. The man who had access to sedatives, medical facilities, and the intimate details of every violent crime in the county. The man who had personally walked Corbin through the crime scene, watching the detective's reactions, judging his work. It was diabolically brilliant. He was inside the investigation from the start, able to monitor and misdirect their every move. The sterile, surgical precision of the mutilations suddenly made sense. But where was the location hidden? The one place you never bothered to look. Corbin's eyes fell on the thick, bound autopsy report for the Blackwood sisters sitting on Finch's desk. He had read the summary, the cause of death, the toxicology. He had never read the entire 100-page document, filled with dense medical jargon. He grabbed it and started flipping through the pages. Tucked into the appendix, hidden amongst diagrams of bone structure, was a page that didn't belong. It was a blueprint. The layout of an old, abandoned medical clinic on the outskirts of town, one that had been owned by Croft's family for generations. He was on the radio immediately, dispatching every available unit to the Croft clinic. He raced across town, the 60-minute deadline screaming in his head. He arrived as SWAT teams were setting up a perimeter. He didn't wait. He went in the back, alone. The clinic was dark and smelled of antiseptic and decay. He followed the sound of a child's quiet sobbing down a long corridor and into an old operating theater. The scene from the video feed was there in front of him. Harding's family was tied to chairs, and standing over them was Dr. Alistair Croft, still in his surgical scrubs, holding a scalpel. He wasn't wearing a mask anymore. His face was calm, almost serene. "Detective Corbin," he said, his voice smooth and professional. "Punctual. I'm impressed." "It's over, Croft," Corbin said, his voice steady, his gun aimed at the doctor's chest. "Over? My dear man, it is transcendent," Croft said, a messianic gleam in his eyes. "For years, I have been a critic, a man forced to study the clumsy, pathetic, artless violence of lesser men. The drunk who beats his wife to death. The junkie who stabs a man for $20. It was an insult to the purity of death. I wanted to create something better, something perfect." He gestured to Harding's family. "This was to be my statement on the nature of control. To show that even those who believe they are protectors are nothing but helpless spectators. But you, detective, you have become part of the art. The final, unexpected character in the play." In that split second, as Croft raised the scalpel, Corbin saw the entire twisted narrative. Croft, the wealthy, brilliant, and utterly psychopathic patron, had recruited Finch, the obsessive artist, and Thorne, the brutal craftsman. He had orchestrated the Blackwood murders as his first grand exhibition. He had planned Thorne's capture and was likely going to dispose of Finch as well. He was the sole author, the invisible god of his own sick world. There was no more time for talk. As Croft lunged towards the nearest child, Corbin fired. A single, clean shot. The scalpel clattered to the floor. Dr. Alistair Croft, the patron of broken things, collapsed in a heap, his own perfect vision ending in a messy, artless sprawl of blood. In the aftermath, Havenwood tried to heal. Thorne and Finch, facing the truth of their patron's betrayal and the overwhelming evidence against them, gave full confessions, detailing years of manipulation and escalating depravity under Croft's direction. The missing persons cases from other states were closed. The story of the mad doctor, the obsessive photographer, and the brutal sculptor became a cautionary tale, a modern-day Gothic legend. The Blackwood Manor was eventually sold, its contents auctioned off. Lyra's journals were published by a distant relative, her posthumous words becoming a tragic, beautiful bestseller. Serafina's music and Alara's paintings gained a new, morbid notoriety. The sisters, in death, achieved a level of fame they had never sought in life. Detective Miles Corbin didn't stay in Havenwood. The case had saved Harding's family, but it had broken something inside him. He had looked into the abyss, and the art director of that abyss had been wearing a coroner's coat. He had one, but it felt like a profound loss. He had silenced the artist, but the echoes of his terrible work would linger forever. He moved away, seeking a quiet anonymity he knew he would likely never find, haunted by the memory of 3 gifted sisters, the porcelain dolls they were forced to become, and the chilling discovery that the most monstrous art is often hidden behind the most respectable of masks.